You want answers?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
Answers?
And did my family?
I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth.
And you have offended a Shaolin temple.
You can't handle the truth.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Hoorah!
Radical rant.
Oh boy, I got some stuff for rant today. 10 reasons why overweight, smoking, drinking gambler Bill Bennett is wrong about the legalization of marijuana. Now, you may have caught this. Former U.S. drug czar Bill Bennett recently penned an op-ed on CNN.com entitled, "Why Barney Frank and Ron Paul Are Wrong on Drug Legalization." And this was in response to the two congressmen filing H.R. 2306, the bill to end federal marijuana criminalization. Our own Paul Armentano has already done quite a good job debunking this on the Normal blog, noting that the bill does not legalize drugs or even so much as legalize marijuana. Rather, this legislation removes the power to prosecute minor marijuana offenders from the federal government and relinquishes this authority to state and local jurisdictions. Well, that's where I'm going to take over and attack the substance of Bennett's op-ed and the style of his argument, because it's a perfect example of reefer-mad prohibitionist argument, and I'm afraid that the casual reader might be persuaded by some of his faulty reasoning. In passing, I would also like to mention that Bill Bennett has enjoyed fatty foods to excess, consumed toxic and addictive alcohol and tobacco regularly, and once admitted to an $8 million gambling habit. So forgive me if I grant Bennett's proclamations on virtue and healthy lifestyle choices with the same respect I give celebrities who tell me to go vegetarian to save the environment while they're flying cross-country on private jets. Anyway, let's go to these 10 reasons. Number 1, never talk about legalizing marijuana. Always talk about legalizing drugs. You notice right from the beginning, right from his title there, where he's saying why Barney Frank and Ron Paul are wrong on drug legalization. I'm not talking about drug legalization, but that's the prime directive of prohibitionist pros. Legalizing marijuana is actually becoming quite popular. Nobody's really that afraid of marijuana. But drugs, oh, why, that's terrifying. Heroin and cocaine and meth, oh my! Never mind that Barney Frank and Ron Paul didn't submit a bill to legalize drugs, but merely depenalize cannabis. Ron Paul once said he'd legalize heroin, and that's all Bennett needs to justify his link. Now, here's how you defuse this bullet point. Should all drugs be legal? Well, cocaine and meth are already legal. They're Schedule II drugs. They can be prescribed by doctors anywhere in the United States. Legal is a broad spectrum that ranges from over-the-counter aspirin for anybody of any age with no ID at the convenience store, to strictly carded 21 and over alcohol at the liquor store, all the way up to seriously restricted operating room morphine. So sure, all drugs should be legal, but where they land on that spectrum is what matters. Heroin ought to be closer to operating room legal. Cannabis should probably be closer to the alcohol legal. The number 2 thing, my God, what about the children? And this is, quote, from Bennett's piece, quote, "Starting with the basics, keeping drugs illegal is one of the best ways to keep drugs out of the hands and brains of children. We know 3 things here. First, children who don't use drugs continually tell us one of the reasons they don't is precisely because they are illegal." Now, no prohibitionist worth his salt will pen an op-ed without appealing to the safety of the children. It's one of the few effective pieces of rhetoric they still have. But there's one quick bit of jujitsu you can use on this one. So, it is your claim that the only effective way we can protect children from marijuana is to imprison adults who use marijuana? If so, how is it that we reduced 12th grade lifetime drinking rates from 90% to 75%, and reduced lifetime smoking rates from 75% to about 40% without imprisoning any adults for smoking and drinking? Now, Bennett cites some stats about the perception of risk and social disapproval being the reasons that kids don't take drugs. So, how is it that in the Netherlands, a place that socially tolerates adult cannabis use and places very little perception of risk on that, the rates of lifetime cannabis use are half what they are for American 12th graders and 1/3 what they are for American 15-year-olds? Now, sure, the kids who don't smoke pot tell you they don't because it's illegal, but what difference does that make to the 2 out of 5 high school seniors who have? Another quote from the Bennett piece, quote, Second, keeping drugs out of the hands of children is the best way to prevent drug addiction generally, as study after study has confirmed that if we keep a child drug-free until age 21, the chances of use in adulthood are next to zero. Well, I guess I'm that next to zero guy, because I smoked my first joint when I was 22 years old. But what Bennett hides is the fact that we aren't keeping cannabis out of the hands of kids. Kids consistently rate cannabis as easy or fairly easy to get. And we're talking 80% to 90% ranges over 30 years of asking this question. And more than a quarter of kids can say they can get weed within a few hours. His number 3 point. We have enough problems with legal drugs. Why would we add another? And this is the quote from the Bennett piece. Third, we don't need to guess at hypothetical legalization schemes. Our experience with legally prescribed narcotics has already proven it, and we now have an epidemic. This, despite doing everything the theorists have asked, from oversight to regulation to prescription requirements. Yeah, Bill, but in this case we're talking about things like OxyContin that are highly addictive, unlike cannabis. And couldn't part of this epidemic be due to the massive advertising by pharmaceutical companies that tout the pill as the answer to all life's maladies, or pharmaceutical reps that hand out free samples and encourage doctors to distribute them like candy? And in some cases, didn't some of these opioid users get addicted because a doctor couldn't prescribe a safer, more effective, non-addictive remedy because it's Schedule 1? Regardless, Bennett's point only makes sense in some fantasy land where the current policy of prohibiting marijuana has no downside. We're not adding another legal drug. We're recognizing that regulating cannabis reaps more benefit and causes less harm than prohibiting it. Now, speaking of those harms, his number 4 point, the fourth reason why overweight, drinking, smoking gambler Bill Bennett is wrong on legalization: we must keep it illegal to keep it expensive. Here's the quote from Bennett. Normalizing, destigmatizing, and legalizing illegal drugs lowers their price and increases their use. As a recent RAND study on California found, legalization of marijuana there would cut the price by as much as 80% and increase use from as little as 50% to as much as 100%. Just what California, just what our society needs. So, is Bennett arguing here that only the high price of marijuana protects us from total destabilization of our society? Funny that he should be in favor of artificial price supports for street corner dealers and Mexican drug gangs. A price cut by 80% in a regulated market means that what little black market dealing that would occur would have the tiniest of profit margins. You'd be as likely to see a big-time violent black market weed dealer under legalization as you'd find a big-time violent black market Budweiser dealer today. And as for twice the use, we don't need to guess those results because use was about twice what it is today back in 1978, 1979. Oh no! We might have wars in the Middle East, expensive gasoline, crumbling schools, mass unemployment, inflation, ridiculous fashions, and horrible dance music. Not like today. The number 5 reason: we're doing it for your own good. And here's the quote from Bennett. As any parent with a child addicted to drugs will explain, as any visit to a drug rehab center will convey, those caught in a web of addiction are anything but free. And it is not because of their incarceration or rehabilitation. It is because of the vicious cycle of dependency, waste, and brain damage addiction and abuse can cause. What about problem gamblers, Bill? Were you anything but free when you were caught in that addiction? Gee, how in the world were you free to say, quote, your gambling days are over, end quote, in 2003 without going to rehab and without the heavy hand of the state and the threat of force and prison to help you? Look, I don't make light of the addictive nature of hard drugs like heroin, cocaine, meth, nicotine, and alcohol. But the fact that millions of Americans voluntarily stop using cannabis for weeks or months to pass a workplace pre-employment PET test kind of shows us that cannabis isn't terribly addictive. Our number 6 reason why drinking, overweight, gambling, smoking Bill Bennett is wrong on legalization: it's not your father's Woodstock weed. Here's the quote. Let us make no mistake about this either. marijuana is much more potent and causes much more damage than we used to know. Today's marijuana tests on average at more than 10% THC, the psychoactive ingredient. We are even seeing samples of more than 30% THC. This is compared to the relatively lower levels of THC most legalizing proponents were more familiar with in generations past, under 4% in the early 1980s, even lower in the 1960s. Oh, okay, so you'd be okay with us legalizing the under 4% THC cannabis then, wouldn't you? Oh, you were telling us it was terribly dangerous then, right? So it must be super duper double dangerous now. Well, first of all, Bill, we have a legal Schedule III drug called Marinol, which is a 100% THC suspended in sesame oil in a capsule, and that doesn't seem to be so super duper harmful, and it's nothing but THC. Got no CBDs, got no CBNs, CBGs, CBGBs, cannabidabidoo. That's got nothing else in it. Just THC, the psychoactive ingredient. But 100% of that's fine as long as it's in a pill. 10, 15, 20% of that in a plant, you got a problem with. Look, Bill, here's the thing. It's not like the craps table. It's not like the $1,000 craps table that busts your bank account 10 times faster than the $100 craps table. People smoke weed to get high. If they have 5% THC weed, they'll smoke a joint. If they have 20% THC weed, they'll smoke a quarter of that joint. When you consider the smoke's the only harmful part of pot smoking, smoking a quarter as much is a good thing, isn't it? Oh, and by the way, don't believe this hype about the marijuana of the 1980s being less than 4%. Industrial hemp comes in at 2% or less, right? I do not believe people were smoking hemp. And to say that it was even lower in the 1960s, Bill, you're just revealing your ignorance because the technology to test for THC potency didn't exist until the 1970s. He goes on with point number 7. It's really, really bad for teenagers. Here's the quote. Chronic adolescent marijuana use has been found to be associated with, quote, poorer performance on thinking tasks, including slower psychomotor speed and poorer complex attention, verbal memory, and planning ability, end quote. We are seeing study after study finding adolescent marijuana use responsible for, quote, disrupted brain development, end quote, in teens. Worse, we are seeing more and more studies showing teen marijuana use linked to psychosis. Have you ever seen the brain scans or checked the accident and fatality stats of a teenage binge drinker? They'll show you far more damage than any pot-smoking teen would. Look, again, you tell of this awful fate awaiting our children that it requires locking up adults for pot, yet you do not set that same standard for alcohol. Why is that? You also ignore lots and lots and lots of studies showing that marijuana can actually have a protective effect, the most recent of which showing that teenagers who binge drink and smoke marijuana have more protective effect from the depletion of white matter than the binge drinkers alone. Now, this is not to say kids should go out to the kegger and load up on bong hits, but what we are saying is you cherry pick every little negative study you can find and never show any of the positive studies. Nobody wants teenagers smoking pot. That's not anybody's goal here. The question is, do we have to lock up adults and ruin their lives to accomplish that? And that leads me to the next point. Nobody really goes to prison for pot. This is from Bennett here, quote, as for the high incarceration rates for simple marijuana use and possession, it is a myth. As government documentation actually shows, over 97% of sentencing on federal marijuana-related charges is for trafficking. Less than 2% is for simple possession. Indeed, the only National Review Authority with federal prosecutorial experience that I know of backs this point up. Quote, actual enforcement is targeted at big distributors. People who merely possess drugs for personal use well know they are substantially safe, no matter what the statutes say. End quote. Yeah, Bill. Federal charges. The vast majority of marijuana arrests and sentencing happen at the state level, which leads me to wonder why the federal statutes still carry a 1 year and $1,000 misdemeanor penalty for simple possession of any amount. We don't really arrest anyone for possession, so that's why it's vitally important it remains illegal? How can marijuana be simultaneously so dangerous we must imprison those who supply it, but so innocuous we must rarely imprison white people who demand it? Besides, the prison sentence isn't the only consequence of the drug arrest, Bill. Drug convictions place you into second-class citizenship in this country, where you can be legally denied jobs, housing, assistance, education, and more on that basis alone. Also, understand that something as simple as keeping 2 strains in separate bags, owning a scale, or planting even a single marijuana plant lands you in cell or manufacturing charges. We got 2 more points here in the top 10 reasons why overweight, drinking, smoking, gambling Bill Bennett is wrong on legalization. If you want to catch these other 2 points, stick with us live here as we move into Hour 2, Toker Talk Radio. For those of you listening on the podcast, one of these days you've got to check it out. We let our hair down, what little there is left of it, in Hour 2. And we take your calls at 971-533-7111. For Ganja John, Wiz Khalico, and the absent Cannabis Carrie, we hope your car gets well soon in Idaho. I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, take care of each other, Tokers.
This is Normal Show Live, the voice of the Marijuana Nation.
Take it on one more time. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth.
All right, folks, welcome back. It's Hour 2, Toker Talk Radio, and I am right in the middle of a rant, so I'm just going to pick up where I left off for those of you who've been listening to Hour 1 here. We gave you the first 8 points, and what's interesting about this, when you deconstruct these drug warriors' arguments, look for the way they're arguing, not necessarily the points they're arguing, because the points they're arguing we know are bullshit. It's the way they're arguing, and you got to figure out why do some people buy that? So just to recap, we've already come upon number 1, never talk about legalizing marijuana, always talk about legalizing drugs. Number 2, my God, what about the children? Number 3, we have enough problems with legal drugs, why add another? Number 4, we must keep it illegal to keep it expensive. Number 5, we're doing it for your own good. Number 6, it's not your father's Woodstock weed. Number 7, it's really, really bad for teenagers. Number 8, nobody really goes to prison for pot. So here we are. We got those first 8. Let's jump right into number 9. The number 9 reason from overweight, drinking, smoking gambler Bill Bennett. The Dutch, Californians, British, or Coloradans now regret tolerating marijuana. Here's the quote from his CNN.com piece. Quote, citizens are trying to put the genie back in the bottle. From Northern California, where residents have complained that medical marijuana has, quote, spawned crime, drug cartels, and teenage pot use, end quote. To the Netherlands, where drug tourism, use by minors, and border trafficking has increased. To England, where apologies have been made for endorsing decriminalization in light of the subsequent growth of teen drug treatment needs. To Colorado, where easy access has increased demand, quote, made a mockery, end quote, of the legal system and is increasingly endangering public safety. All right, well, let me knock each one of these down one by one. California. All right, California. The places with the greatest amount of medical cannabis acceptance also voted yes on Prop 215 to legalize marijuana. In other words, the people who liked the semi-legalization of medical did not see it to be such a problem that they would not vote to move forward with full legalization for everyone. Number 2, the Netherlands. Well, use by minors has increased in the Netherlands, just as it has everywhere in Europe, even in the strict anti-cannabis countries. Now, drug tourism and border trafficking, well, those are the result of prohibition in the rest of the EU, not liberalization in Holland. I mean, indeed, if Germans could get their hash in Hamburg, they wouldn't visit Maastricht, okay? England, the growth of teen drug rehab admissions for cannabis has to do with the increasing use of drug courts and alternative sentencing that sends teens to rehab instead of 3 months to 2 years in jail. You liberalize a policy, and then you say, all right, we will not lock you up, we'll put you in rehab, and then you saw all the kids that went up to rehab, and you said, oh my God, this drug is terrible, we've got to criminalize it. Jeez. And in Colorado, this state loves its medical cannabis law so much, it actually has a medical marijuana revenue enforcement division. It ain't going anywhere, Bill. And finally, the number 10 reason from overweight, smoking, drinking gambler Bill Bennett as to why legalization is a bad idea. If we all unified behind the war on drugs, it would work. For some of my older listeners, you might find a Vietnam allusion in there. Quote, "We have an illegal drug abuse epidemic in this country, and it has not been given enough attention. But the cultural messages, as much as the law, matter. When we unified on this, as we once did, drug use went down. When we let up, as we now have, use increases." Yeah. Well, Bennett likes to think that the get-tough policies of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s led to less drug abuse, and the touchy-feely policies of medical marijuana in the 1990s led to more drug use. However, I would note that cannabis arrests actually decreased 20,000 from the beginning of Reagan to the end of Bush 1. Drug use also rose during the 1970s when Nixon was declaring all-out war on drugs, and cannabis use rose even as Bush 2 was raiding medical marijuana states and using the same mandatory minimum sentences as Reagan and Bush 1 used. Drug use goes in cycles, and it's got lots of factors that affect it. The question isn't whether legalization will cause harm, it's whether it will cause less harm than the prohibition that exists now. Since the Frank Paul bill merely ends federal penalties for cannabis, states can continue to still prohibit it. And now maybe a few of them might legalize. And then those states can be the laboratories of democracy that Supreme Court Justice Brandeis theorized about, and we can really determine which policy works better for the people.